Hello. On this video for Cadillac 472-500, I want to talk about a sheet metal tunnel ram. Now, sheet metal tunnel rams are probably the most homemade intake for the Cadillac engine. Tunnel rams tend to be uh, very good looking. The longer runner seems to help. Extra carburation seems to help. And guys like tunnel rams. So there's a lot of different tunnel rams out there. All of them are homemade. This one I bought off of a guy from a message board years ago. His name was Doug Tillery. He ran a front engine dragster. And he decided to go supercharged instead of being just fuel injected because he's running alcohol injection. When I got this intake, it had a alcohol injector head on it, and it had mechanical fuel injection and injectors in each runner. And that's how Doug was running it. That was the intake he was selling. I bought it knowing darn well I wasn't going to run it that way. I'm on the street. So I removed the top, I removed all the fuel injection stuff, and I made, not this top, but I made a top that ran two Holley square flange carburetors in line. And I had two 700s on it. Now, we dynoed that motor with this intake, and it dynoed really well. On the dyno, it just screamed. So I was really happy about this intake. Now, one of the things I want to point out is this thing is built out of rectangular tubing. And so all he did was find a tubing size that he liked, and that helped him make the runners because then he didn't have to weld up all the runners. So this just has two flat flanges, rectangular tubing, and then really the only thing he had to kind of fab up was the plenum area, which is fair sized, and weld it all together. And so this is all aluminum. It's decently done. It's a nice homemade intake. Like I said, a few corners were cut to try and make it happen. Now, the runner size he chose, these are actually very large. This is much bigger than a stock port. And I ran this on basically a stock port. So he was running it in a dragster, and like I said, alcohol injection. And so I'm sure he probably had hogged out the head a lot to try and get more airflow and made it as big as he could without running into water. And that's what this was basically built for. Now, I picked up this little piece of tubing just to kind of explain there are smaller tubing. If you were to make this one, this tubing is basically more the correct ID for a stock port. Now, because it's big runner and because of how he was using it, even Doug Tillery, when I got this intake and told him I was going to make it carbureted, said I was crazy. He says it'll never run. The runner's too big, the plenum's too big. It's not going to run on the street. You're crazy. You're not going to make it work. And yet, when I got this thing working, it was one of the best intakes I had. This thing really ran amazingly well, considering everything that really wasn't right. And that's part of what I want to explain is the stuff that wasn't right. And yet, I'll get back to why it ran well. So, to start with, just like I said on some of the other intakes, especially like the Acme intake, common mistake is going square to the flange. Now, in Doug's defense, for what he was doing, this was probably correct. Because if he really hogged out the intake, or the intake runner, on the head, he got rid of that bump and he got rid of that down turn. So the port, if you really opened it up to this size, was probably a pretty good match. And I have often wondered on this particular intake how it would do on the Boogeyman head. With the bigger port, this has the bigger runner, and the square port angle that this has, I think this tunnel ram would actually probably run really good on a Boogeyman head. But I've never been able to afford Boogeyman head, so I just have the intake. Now, yeah, if you look, this has got holes for 3 carburetors. Just like the uh, Boogeyman intake, I figured after I ran it that I could make this run with the 12 pack and it'd look really wild. And that would be 3 500 CFM Edelbrocks. Now, I just made this top up, and like I said, I still have the other top that was dual quad spaced correctly so Hollies would fit. So I have some options to run on this. Now, like I said, some of the things that were wrong. Doug pointed out the runner is too big. Now, runner length isn't too bad on this. You've got, that's one of the nice things about tunnel rams is you've got some runner distance you can go, and you can get a little bit of runner length in it, which will help. When I dyno tested this, like I said, it ran really sweet, and I had 2 700 Hollies on it. You know, typical tunnel ram, Holly carburetor, big intake, and the motor wasn't all that built. It had 12-to-1 compression, 902 heads, so it was a late motor with the early head swap and the high compression. And then it was a 204 valve and a 177 exhaust. So this was just a little bit bigger valve and kind of a stock port arrangement. It isn't a raised runner, isn't even really an opened up runner. Basically, I had just taken a late block assembly, threw a cam in it, put some early heads on it, and tossed a big intake on it, and called it good. And so most people would say that wasn't much of any motor. Now, with the Holley carburetors on it, that dynoed at 477 horsepower at 4,300 RPM and 609 foot-pounds of torque at 3,800 RPM. So this actually worked really well. And I'm going to get into why, and why I probably shouldn't have, but why it did. This intake was really all done by about 5,100. Now I tended to shift with this at about 5,700. You can usually go a little bit past the peak. This kind of went up in power and flattened off and was pretty much done at 51, but there was still some power. And in a car, a lot of times, you're not really shifting right at peak. You're shifting past peak, and that gets the RPM better at the RPM drop. But you can usually kind of get the car to carry because you're already moving at that point. So it doesn't always take quite the horsepower that you need at peak. So I was shifting this at 5,700 RPM. This is what was running when I first met Courtney, and he asked what I was shifting at. They don't make any power up there. This was still making 512 foot-pounds of torque. No, 515 foot-pounds of torque at 2,600 RPM. So even though it was a big intake and you'd think the low end was horrible, it really wasn't. And it ran pretty good up to, by the time you hit 59, it's not RPMing anymore. I mean, that's like a wall. So this did really well. Now, when I put it on the head, a regular stock head flows like 226, and I've told you that before. Now, like I said, this head had just a little bit bigger valve. Instead of a 2 inch, it had a 2040, 40 thousandths bigger intake valve, which isn't much of nothing. That just kind of cleans up the seat a bit. Yet, on the head, this flowed 234 CFM. So I was actually getting more flow out of the head than I was with the head by itself. And what I think was happening is, like I said, the stock ports got that downward turn. By this being such a big runner, I think it allowed the air to naturally find a path into that port from this big port and make that funny little swiggle just a little bit better. And I think that's why it ran well. It was really amazing. Now, I'm going to say there was a problem. Once we took it off the dyno and I started driving it on the street, it was fine if you stood on it. But the drivability of it was just horrendous. I mean, you practically had to stand on it to make it go. And that's really hard to drive. And so what I wound up doing to fix it was I took off the two Holley 700 carbs and I put two Edelbrock 500 CFM carbs on it. Now, just like I've talked about in the past, that was about airspeed at low RPM. This was about airspeed in its drivability, the recovery, you get off the throttle, you get back on the throttle. Well, a lot of that is really about airspeed and how quickly the carb recovers from those changes in pressure in the intake. So by going to a smaller carburetor, I basically fixed the drivability problem. Now, I call it a fix. Technically, like I've said in the past, the intake should flow a certain number that's a little higher than what the runner in the head is, that's about the same as the runner in the intake, and the carb should just feed it with just enough plenum. That's really how it's supposed to work. Now, this wasn't meeting any of that. This had too big a runner. This had too much carburation technically for anything other than wide open throttle. If I was just drag racing like Doug was, it would have probably been fine with the 700s. But driving around the street was a different deal. Now, the two 500s did cost me. I am almost positive, I never took it back to the dyno, but it shaved at least 30 horsepower off the top end, maybe closer to 40, right off of the top tier. But I traded that off for this much more flexible drivability. And so that was actually a good fix. And all I was trying to do was basically drive up the airspeed at the carburetor. So this worked very well. Now, I want to talk about RPM a little bit. We talk about tuned runner. Now, this thing has got a fairly long runner. It's not super short like the Boogeyman. You still have the runner that's in the head itself too to add to this length. And technically, Courtney was right because he was running an intake not too dissimilar. His was a little squash flat. He was on alcohol at the time. But he wasn't getting the RPM out of it that I was getting out of this intake. And so that's what got me into doing more of the mathematics of why things work. And the interesting thing is this was making more high-end power than the runner length should have let it do. And what I think is with the big runner size, the big runner diameter, if you actually do the math, the only thing the head was considering runner was the port in the head itself. It thought it had that little, there's like 3.5 or 4 inches of runner in the head itself from the back of the valve. And all it perceived this intake as is plenum. It did not see these as runner because they were way huge. Now, the other thing I want to point out, these were so huge, and I still ran the stock port. It was a terrible mismatch. And that's also something you're not supposed to do. But I think that helped in that it kind of agitated the fuel a little bit. So between helping it make the turn into the head and agitating the fuel, the only real problem this intake had was sluggish air at the carburetor in driving, but it worked well at wide open throttle. So it's kind of a funny thing when you're fussing with intakes. There are exceptions that actually run well, but sometimes for odd reasons. And you don't always know about why or what you're seeing. Now, the math let me finally realize that it wasn't seeing these runners. So if I was to make another one of these, I would certainly go to a smaller port size and try and get it more appropriate to keep the airspeed up. Plus, it also shows you, like in the old Fords, you had Super Cobra Jet, which were huge ports, and you had regular Cobra Jet, which was smaller ports. And some guys would put one intake on, and it's a way huge port mismatch, and they either try and match it or they just let it fly. And some of them said it worked pretty well, but they were probably getting the same thing. They were probably really only using the port in the head as a runner, and the intake itself basically became just all plenum space. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that can happen. But if you get too much plenum space, just like the Boogeyman had, you can see you run into problems. In this case, to kind of fix that plenum problem, I did it at the carburetor instead of splitting it. Now, this intake might be okay split too and trying to get the runner speed up. And it would certainly be okay, and that's the way I think I'd like to use it someday, is if it went on something that had a lot bigger port. And I think it would then be really in its sweet spot on how it runs. So if you're building an intake, you can keep some of those things in mind. And as to what happened with this, it made good numbers. I mean, it did okay for what it was. But you could certainly go better. And like I said, there are fixes. And think about that. If you're running the Bulldog intake and it just doesn't behave itself well, one of the fixes you could do, just like I did on this, is run a substantially smaller carburetor and try and get the airspeed back up. Now, plenum space will make up some for carburetor size, not all. That's why I did lose some power, is because if you become a restriction up here, then you're not moving the air, you're not making the horsepower. Because remember, total air volume, the 234 CFM I got with this on the head, that's what's making the peak power. The torque, the low end, that's about airspeed. The drivability is really about airspeed and airspeed recovery at the carburetor. If it's really a drivability problem, you're really talking about airspeed at the car. If you're talking about just wanting to generate more low-end torque, but it runs better, that's about airspeed in the runner and airspeed at a lower RPM. If you can drive up the airspeed at a lower RPM, you'll make more torque. If you increase the cylinder head flow, the RPM, of course, goes up, and you'll make more power, peak power, horsepower. So the CFM flow number is really about horsepower, and airspeed in the runner is really about torque, and airspeed at the carburetor is really about drivability. So if you have a problem, you can keep some of those things in mind of where is my problem. If my problem is really drivability, then you need to be looking at the carburetor and either why it's not responding. Now in carburetors, you can do other things other than going to a smaller carburetor, though the smaller carburetor will work because it increases the signal at the booster. by having a smaller carburetor, the airspeed in the carburetor goes up and the signal strength goes up. Now there are other ways to increase signal strength. On some Holleys, you'll have either a drop leg booster, which drops it into the venturi a little bit more and gives you a little bit more airspeed and makes the carburetor, even if it's maybe a bigger carburetor, more responsive. That's why some of the carburetors that are like 800 CFM automatically come with a drop leg booster. And then the other is, of course, the angular discharge booster. And that'll do way better at generating a signal to pull fuel. And that's how a lot of the modern, bigger carburetors are getting away with better drivability manners. In that if they have an angular booster, if they can deal with a slightly smaller signal, if the carb will run okay with a slightly smaller pressure drop across the carb, because remember, the air flowing across the carb is because there's a pressure drop across it. So if the carb is set up, a regular Holley from the good old days was 3 inches of mercury or 20.4 inches of water, that's the amount of airflow across the carb that they felt it needed to actually kind of properly meter. That's how that number kind of came into existence. Some of the modern carburetors, especially if you look at the listings, they'll do almost half that. You know, they'll meter okay with maybe only a 15-inch of water drop across it, or 2 inches of mercury instead of 3 inches of mercury, and that's the differential pressure across the carb and how well they meter. So, like I said, if you're having drivability problems, be thinking carburetor and what you can do to help your metering in the carburetor. Either going by a higher quality carburetor or going to a smaller carburetor or maybe a little bit of both. Now, if you're working on torque itself, the carburetor airspeed really isn't about torque. That's really about the runner airspeed. And we'll get into that with another intake. The carburetor is drivability, your runner airspeed is torque, your total airflow is horsepower. And I thought I had kind of shown that through this whole series about intakes, but I've had a few questions from some people where obviously I didn't make it quite clear enough. So I thought on this one I would show how clear it is. Plus, always remember that little squiggle into the port is important. The only reason this worked was because I got lucky. I didn't understand that at the time. Now that I kind of understand how it works, I might go back and see if I can design a port that will get that extra airflow by matching the little squiggle in the stock port. Now that's technically not the right way to do it. Bends in the runner and fuel don't get along. Usually you are way better off if you can get a straighter run. And that's why the Boogeyman head has a whole different port style, super raised port that extended so the intake will fit. Its purpose is to try and get that straighter shot. But I kind of think maybe a version of the Edelbrock that had a little better port match would behave itself better and work maybe better as like an RPM intake. So anyway, that's the tonal ram. Like I said, there's lots of designs of tonal ram out there. Even if you go all the way back to the days of Hale, and I don't know how many people know, but Jeff Hale and Courtney, Flash Automotive, which is CAD company, were the original two people kind of doing high performance Cadillac when Larry started doing Cadillac Motorsport Development, CMD, out of California. And those two guys are the ones that gave him most of the information on how Cadillacs run. And Hale, even way back in the day, was running basically a tunnel ram using exhaust tubing. A lot of people will use exhaust tubing to build a intake because it's easy to do. We'll talk more about that in the homemade intake section. But tunnel rams usually work pretty well because of a longer runner, a little straighter shot. If you ever watch a lot of dyno videos, you'll see that tonal rams have this tendency to win, and I really like this one. Even though it's wrong, it's the wrong size, it's too much plenum. Man, this thing was fun to drive. It looked cool on the car. It was just great. And I'm hoping it'll run just as well with 3 carbs on it. It may not. I may have to do a divider or something else. Or I might just build another intake and see how it goes. So anyway, that's my sheet metal tonal ram from Doug Tillery years ago. He did better than he thought. But anyway, I wish you luck. There's lots of tonal rams out there. So now that you kind of understand some of how it works, you can look at a homemade intake and maybe make a better decision about whether or not it's going to work for you. So anyway, that's my tonal ram, and we'll go on to another video. Have a good day.